From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Of the Washington Post's Sunday Outlook section. The Post is very, very proud to be a charter sponsor of the festival again this year. Before we get started, I need to inform you that the pavilion's presentations are being filmed for the Library of Congress's website and for their archive. Please be mindful of this as you enjoy the presentation. In addition, please do not sit on the camera risers that are located in the back of the pavilion. Thank you. It is my great pleasure to be introducing Margaret Peterson Haddix today. Margaret grew up on a farm in Ohio, and after graduating from Miami University, worked for several years as a newspaper editor and reporter. Her years as a journalist who covered fact helped pave the way for her fiction in a number of ways, not least by making her an astonishingly fast, productive writer. Today, she is the author of more than 20 books for kids and teens. They include Running Out of Time, Mrs. Dunphrey, the Shadow Children's series, and Found, which is the first book in a new series called The Missing. Her books have been honored with the International Reading Association's Children's Book Award and the American Library Association's Best Book and Quick Pick for Reluctant Young Adult Readers notations, among other awards and citations. Her two most recent books are Into the Gauntlet, the 10th and final volume in the 39 Clues series, and Claim to Fame. Claim to Fame tells the story of Lindsay Scott, a teenager who, as a young child, was the star of a hit TV show, but who withdrew from the public eye after what looked like a nervous breakdown. Now, at 16, she's back in the news with a tabloid newspaper claiming that she is being held hostage by her father. The truth turns out to be quite different. Reviewers have hailed Claim to Fame as a thought-provoking story laced with themes of transcendentalism, self-centeredness, and the importance of human connectivity. The bulletin of the Center for Children's Books has this to say: Haddix's characters are, as usual, superbly drawn, and Lindsay's struggle to shape her identity independent of what others think of her will surely resonate with many young readers. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Peterson Haddix.
Thank you. I actually have an even newer book, which somehow I think that information was neglected to be given to somebody, but I'm out promoting Sabotage, which is the third book in the Missing series. And I'm discovering that it's very difficult to talk about a third book in a series when sometimes people don't know anything about the series as a whole. So I'm kind of backing up and explaining a little bit about the first book, which is called Found. And the way I got that idea for that particular book and the series as a whole was all because I fell asleep on an airplane. And I woke up just as the plane was starting to land. And because I had been very tired and it was a long trip, I was totally disoriented when I woke up. I could not remember where I had been, couldn't remember where I was going. And in that very first instant of waking up, I really wasn't even sure who I was. So I was really confused. Now, fortunately, it was not a case of long-term amnesia. In a few minutes, once I was fully awake, I remembered who I was, where I was going, where I'd been. I was fine. But I was really fascinated by that moment of just total disorientation and total confusion. And as an author, anytime there's something that really fascinates me, I kind of automatically think, how can I put that in a book? And so I started thinking about the fact that as an adult, anytime I fly on an airplane, I have to have some form of identification, either a passport or a driver's license or something like that. But kids are allowed to fly on airplanes without identification. And so I started thinking that there could be a kid or an entire group of kids who were disoriented and confused on an airplane. And if there weren't any adults with them who knew who they were, how would anybody know? And the more I thought about this idea, the more it evolved and changed. And pretty soon, I wasn't just thinking about a kid or a group of kids being lost and disoriented on an airplane. I was thinking about a bunch of babies showing up out of nowhere and nobody knowing who they were. And so that is how the first book in the series, Found, begins. A plane lands at an airport in the Midwest, and it's not scheduled to land, and nobody knows what it's doing there. And they try to talk to the pilot. Pilot doesn't respond. So finally, somebody just walks onto the airplane and discovers that there's not a single adult on the entire plane. But every seat in the passenger section is full. Every seat contains a baby. And then the action skips ahead 13 years, and there are these two 13-year-old boys named Jonah and Chip, who in the course of talking to each other discover that both of them were adopted as infants, and neither of them knows anything about their birth parents. And in Jonah's case, he doesn't think that's a big deal. He's always known he was adopted. His attitude is kind of like, well, so what? But then he and Chip both start getting these mysterious letters. And the first letter that they get says, "You are one of the missing." And that's all it says, and they don't know what this means. They don't know if it's a prank. They don't know if they should take it seriously. They're just kind of freaked out by the whole thing. Then they get the second letter. And the second letter says, "Beware, they're coming back to get you." And then a lot of other things happen in the book, but I won't tell you what they are because it would ruin it if you haven't read the book. I will tell you that after that, The Missing becomes a time travel series. And in the second book, which is called Sent, Jonah and Chip and Jonah's younger brother, Catherine, and another boy whose name is Alex, all go back to the year 1483 together. And I can tell you, having done a lot of research about the year 1483, that that is not at all the year that I would choose to go back to if I had the power to travel through time. Mainly because I happen to like indoor plumbing. And the Middle Ages were just not a very pleasant time to live in, and very dangerous, including dangerous to my poor characters. And then in this book, I move to another time period and another story of children in danger. And it revolves around the Virginia Dare story. And I'm just curious if anybody would raise their hand if you learned about Virginia Dare when you were in school. Okay, I saw this boy back here had his hand up immediately. Let's see the hands. Who learned about it? This is very interesting because I just started my book tour promoting this book in California. And evidently that Virginia Dare stories is not at all in the curriculum in California. So I'm saying, does anybody know who Virginia Dare is? And I have classrooms full of blank looks looking at me, so I have to tell the whole story. But I can tell here that many of you already know this story. It's a fascinating story that Virginia Dare was the first English child born in North America, because she was born in the first English colony, which was not terribly far away from here in what is now North Carolina. And the funny thing about her is I kind of think of it as being like if nowadays we had a colony started on Mars. And I think that if there was a colony started in Mars, if there were a child who was the very first child born in Mars, we would know everything about this child's entire existence, that pretty much every minute of her life would probably be filmed and recorded. And when it got to be the little Martian baby's first birthday, it'd be like, oh, the first child born on Mars is now 1 year old. And then you'd see her 5th birthday. And when she graduated from high school, you'd know exactly how that went. Well, in 1587, when Virginia Dare was the first English child born in the Roanoke colony, it was a little bit harder to keep track of people. In fact, we really only know 2 things about her. We know that she was born, we know that she was baptized, and that's it. because the main person who was keeping track of her and everything else in the Roanoke colony was her grandfather, who left when she was only about 9 days old, went back to England to get more supplies, and intended to come right away to help his colony. But because of various problems, including the Spanish Armada, it was 3 years before he was able to come back and see how his colony was doing. And so finally, he got back to Roanoke Island to see his colony, and nobody was there. And there was only one word as a clue, the word Croatoan, carved into a post. And from that, he decided that it probably meant that his entire colony had moved to a nearby island called Croatoan. And it is amazing to me that after that, nobody went to check on Croatoan to see what happened to his colony. So for the past 400 years, people have wondered what happened to Virginia Dare and the other 100 or so colonists who were in the Roanoke colony. And as the more research I did about this, the more I really, really, really wanted to know what really happened. And I think at the distance of 400 years, it's pretty impossible to know for sure. So I got to make up all sorts of different things as possibilities. And my explanation in Sabotage includes things like time travel as an explanation for what happened. So I'm guessing that it's probably not the most plausible explanation for what happened. But I had a great deal of fun making all of that up, and I really hope that readers will also enjoy the story a lot. So I think I left an adequate amount of time that if people want to start coming up to the microphones, you can do that, and you are welcome to ask about any of my books. You can ask about this series or anything else. And I'll kind of bounce back and forth between the microphones. So I'll start right there.
What was the inspiration for the Shadow Children series?
What was the inspiration for the Shadow Children series? I first started thinking about that idea because my husband and I were trying to decide whether to have a third child. And this was a hard decision for us to make when our kids were being very sweet and loving and, wrapping their arms around us and saying, "We love you, Mommy. We love you, Daddy." We'd think, "Oh, it's so wonderful being parents. Let's just have 20 kids." And then other times, and I'm sure all the parents in the crowd can perhaps identify with this moment, when our kids were doing things like throwing temper tantrums because, "Mommy, my socks are on crooked, make it stop!" We would think, it is really hard being parents. There is no way we could have a third child. If we had 3 kids, we'd be outnumbered. That would be impossible. So we'd go back and forth, and it's really hard to make a decision under those circumstances. So we started looking for something factual and rational to help us. And so we started talking about overpopulation. And in the context of trying to make such a personal decision myself, thinking about the fact that in some countries in the world, people are told how many kids they are allowed to have, that made me start thinking about how awful that would be. And so it made me think of this society where people are only allowed to have 2 kids. And so Luke, the main character, has to hide because he's a third child. Yes?
In the Missing series, you were doing people like Virginia Dare. Would you do any of the books on Anastasia Romanoff?
The question is, in the Missing series, since I'm looking at mystery children of history like Virginia Dare, would I consider doing someone like Anastasia Romanoff? That is actually someone that at the beginning I very much intended to explore that story. And then between the time that I wrote the first book, Found, and the time that I'm thinking I would be writing that book, there was this major news that came out of Russia, which was that they have positively identified her bones and determined that, yes, she was killed. Definitely, they know that for a fact. And so that really complicates things for me. And I'm trying to figure out, I think I may have a way to work around that, but I haven't totally decided how that's going to work. So that would probably be the 6th book in the series. I've already actually written the 4th book, which is called Torn. The 5th book I'm working on now, which is called Caught, I think. And then that would be the 6th book, and then the 7th book will be the final one. But I've still got a little bit of time before I have to make that decision.
I'm 13 and I love reading your books. When you were my age, what stuff did you like to read?
I pretty much read anything I could get my hands on when I was 13, including cereal boxes, you know, if there wasn't anything else available. It's like, oh, really? That's in there? Who knew? So I enjoyed reading a lot of older books because they'd belonged to my mother or my grandmother, things like Little Women and Anne of Green Gables. One of my favorite books was from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Lee Frankweiler by E.L. Konigsberg, which I think must be a favorite book of many people. But I probably read that book about 8 or 9 times because I just loved it so much.
Okay.
What's your favorite book that you've written?
What is my favorite book that I've written? I actually do not have a favorite book out of the ones that I've written because it's kind of like trying to pick a favorite between my kids, and I couldn't do that. And it's kind of the same way with the books, that I feel like if I picked one of the books, then the other books would get their feelings hurt.
So I heard you just said that you're doing 7 books.
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide to stop instead of like the 36 missing children? You're stopping at 7.
You know, I have had a lot of people ask me, since I do mention that there were 36 babies on this plane, why aren't I doing 36 books? Because that makes sense. And I'm thinking at a certain point it would get very difficult to write that many books. So I definitely know that I want to stop before 36. And I would much rather stop while people are still saying, wow, we love this series, instead of, oh no, not another one of those books. So I kind of arbitrarily settled on 7, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to work it so you get information about all 36 kids. I did in Sabotaged, it tells the story of 3 of the missing kids. So I've kind of worked it that way. I don't think I'm going to manage, you know, I need to do quick math here to figure out if I've got 3 more books left and I've still got, like 30-some people left. That's 10 kids per book. I'm not going to succeed in doing that, but I'm going to kind of throw in some information at a certain point so you do get to know what happens to all 36.
Is there any advice you would give a kid who wants to be an author when she grows up?
There is advice that I would give somebody who wants to be an author when she grows up. I would say 2 things that seem very obvious, but it's surprising to me how many adults don't know to follow this advice. I would say read all that you can, because the more that you read, the more comfortable you are with words, the better you are at dealing with them, and it's fun too. So it's kind of a painless way to get better as a writer. I would say start writing now and write all sorts of different things. I actually wrote a lot more poetry when I was a kid than anything else, but I think that helped me playing around with words and gave me a lot of experience. Keeping a journal is a wonderful thing to do because that gives you a lot of practice with taking things from real life and getting it down into words. And you'd be surprised, even if you think your life is really boring now, I can pretty much guarantee that, you know, in 10 or 20 years, if you go back and reread a journal that you kept as a kid, you'd be like, wow, I'm so glad I wrote this, and I still have this to know what my childhood was like. So that's a very good thing. In general, I would also just say pay attention to things around you and think, because thinking is pretty essential to writing.
I can't believe you're giving me advice. Thank you.
What books and TV shows and movies inspire you to write?
Anytime I read something that is really, really, really good, it inspires me to write. Even though I think, okay, there's no way what I'm writing is going to be that good, but there's a great idea out there and it makes me want to be more inventive myself.
I was wondering if you were planning on starting any more series?
Right now, I'm kind of focused on finishing this series, and I have to admit, this is the 2nd series that I've done that's all mine. I also did the 139 Clues book that I just did 1 of the 10 books. And I really had a hard time in between the two series coming up with the idea for this one, that I was thinking, well, maybe I'm just a one series person. I'm not a two series person. So I'm really trying not to put that pressure on me to try to think about what the third one's going to be yet.
I've read all the 39 Clues books, and I just love them. Are there going to be any more? Was book 10 the last one, or is there?
That is an excellent question, and if you had asked me that before Wednesday, I would have had to be very mysterious and kind of hem and haw and pretend like I didn't really know the answer, because on Thursday it was just announced that they are going to do another series that's related to the 39 Clues series with Amy and Dan still as the heroes. But it's going to be called The Cahills versus the Vespers, and there will be 6 books in that series. So it's not like a continuation of the 39 Clues series, but it is definitely another way to find out more about what's happening to Dan and Amy and the other Cahills.
Where I live, there's something called Battle of the Books. It's where they pick the best books that are more interesting to children, and they use them to battle with the questions. And the book that they chose by you is Among the Hidden. What do you think was the best fact in that made them choose that?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the last part of that question.
What do you think the best fact in Among the Hidden that would make them choose that?
What do I think is the reason that they chose Among the Hidden for that? I think one of the things that I have heard from lots of kids over the years about what makes Among the Hidden popular is that it is something that appeals to both boys and girls. And a lot of times, I know schools have trouble finding books that both boys and girls will like. So that was probably something that helped it.
Thank you.
What was your inspiration for Uprising?
Uprising was the first book that I'd ever written where I was not the person who came up with the original idea for the book. It was actually suggested to me by my editor that he thought that there should be a young adult novel about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in the early 1900s in New York City, which was a very tragic event where 146 people were killed, mainly teenage girls who worked in this factory where they generally would lock the doors as soon as the workers got there in the morning. And so when a fire broke out, a lot of them died. And it was an important event in history that made a change in a lot of the laws that deal with how employers can treat employees. It was a very important event, but obviously also very tragic. And my editor had suggested that I might want to do something about it because he thought it was so important. The kind of funny thing is, by the time I actually wrote the book, another author had written a novel about it as well for young adults called Ashes of Roses by Mary Jane Ash. And I have heard that that's a very good book, but I had gotten so deep into the research for this that I think maybe in 10 years or so, I might be ready to read something else about it that somebody else has done. But I think I need a break for a while before that.
What gave you the idea for the Palace of Mirrors?
What gave me the idea for the Palace of Mirrors? Let me double check something. How much time do I have left? Are we down to 5 minutes? I've got time? Okay. It's a long story, so that's why I have to check that. The inspiration for the Palace of Mirrors actually dates all the way back to when I was in high school. And I grew up in a very rural area of Ohio. And the big deal every summer where I grew up was the county fair. And so I was very proud my senior year in high school because I got to be one of the county fair queen attendants, which meant that every day for that week I got to wear a tiara and a sash and a frilly dress and high-heeled shoes and then walk through hog manure to give kids ribbons for their prized hogs or cows or chickens or whatever they brought to the fair. And now that I'm an adult thinking about that, I think, why did I wear open-toed high-heeled shoes? Ooh, that was gross. But at the time, it was just a fun week. The week ended, I packed stuff away, went off to college very shortly after that, and really stopped thinking of myself as the type of person who would ever wear a tiara and a sash. So then years after that, when my daughter was in kindergarten, she came home from school one day and announced that she was going to be a fairy princess for Halloween. And so I was thinking how we'd carry this costume off, and I thought, that tiara that I wore as a county fair queen attendant, that would be perfect for her costume. And my next thought was, I have no idea whatever happened to that tiara. And this sentence just jumped into my mind. And the sentence was, somewhere in the world, I have a tiara in a little box. And I really liked that sentence. I wrote it down in this writer's journal that I keep, and periodically I would look at that sentence and think, that would be a really good first sentence for a book. I just have no idea what the other sentences in the book would be. And eventually I figured out that the book needed to have nothing to do with county fairs, but needed to be about a girl who was the true royalty of her kingdom, but was not allowed to tell anyone because her life was in danger, which, as you know, is what happens in Palace of Mirrors. Yes?
I read Found and Sent, and I haven't read Sabotaged, so I'm not sure if it's in that book. But I was wondering if you had written it in Sabotaged, or if you had already decided what Jonah's identity was?
That is a very good question, and that's a question that I get asked a lot. What is Jonah's identity? I do not reveal it in Sabotage, and at the moment, my plan is not to reveal it until the 7th book.
Okay.
Yes?
How did you decide not to use babies on the plane and not like children or something?
Well, the question is, how did I decide to use babies on a plane instead of just leaving it as children? As I thought about it, unless I wanted to write about a whole group of children who suddenly got amnesia all at the same time, which would be a little bit difficult to explain, I had to figure out some way to explain why they didn't remember where they came from. And babies, very fortunately for me, don't remember where they came from. So that was part of my rationale. And actually, I think it's more mysterious that it's babies.
Yeah.
Why did you do some of the different things that you did in the final 39 Clues book?
Was the question, why did I do some of the things that I did in the 39 Clues book? Well, it's kind of a mix of some of the things I was told I needed to do because the series needed to be consistent with the things earlier, that I was told that it needed to take place part of the time in England. I was told that I needed to work William Shakespeare in as the historical figure. And there were a couple other things that I was told that I needed to do. And other than that, it was kind of what I wanted to imagine and how I could work things out. And I kind of played off the idea of things that I thought would be interesting to throw in there in England and things that I thought would be interesting to throw in there from William Shakespeare's life. And one of the things that I thought was fun when I was doing the research about William Shakespeare getting ready to write this book was that I discovered that even though William Shakespeare is pretty much, everybody almost entirely agrees that he's the greatest writer who's ever lived. But evidently, he really could not spell. And they have 6 signatures that he has done that they're pretty sure he was really the person who wrote them. None of them are spelled exactly the same way. So it's pretty funny that, here's the greatest writer ever, and he couldn't spell. Now, in his defense, during his time period, there was no such thing as standardized spelling. Pretty much everybody just spelled things however they felt like. So for you kids, that meant no spelling tests in William Shakespeare's time, which would have been really nice, I'm sure. But it also meant that it was very confusing when people tried to read things. So I thought that was a fun detail. So I put that in there. There were lots of other things like that as I was doing the research, I discovered that I wanted to put in.
Where did you get your idea for Just Ella?
Where did I get my idea for Just Ella? Well, that dates back to when my daughter was really little, and she's a senior in high school now, so this was many years ago. And she was obsessed with fairy tales when she was about 2, 3, 4 years old. And so she could sit there for hours having me read fairy tales to her, which I was very proud that she had such an attention span, and I was glad that she loved books already. But reading those fairy tales to her, they started really bugging me. And it really bugged me that it seemed like in every single fairy tale I read to her, at some point there would be a sentence that was something like, and then the prince took one look at her and fell in love because she was so beautiful. And I felt like saying to my daughter, okay, honey, if this strange guy that you've never met before comes up to you and gets down on bended knee and says, will you marry me? Do not say yes right away. You know, if he seems like he might be a decent guy, maybe you can say maybe. But this whole love at first sight idea was a little bit scary. So writing Just Ella was kind of my way of dealing with that. And because I couldn't say all that to my daughter when she was only 2 or 3 years old, so I wrote the book instead. Okay, I think we're done then. I'm being told by the timekeeper here. So thank you very much for your great questions.
Thanks for coming up, guys. So close, so close.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.